David, you know, you write and talk a lot about opposition, and you particularly in the book here, but the cost of being a Christian it's rising daily. It's rather frightening, to be honest. And give me your thoughts on it, because this is a problem that's growing out of control.
As I mentioned, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, silence in the face of evil is itself evil. It's a double-edged sword, really. There's a cost. Anyone who's going to speak up and be a Christian, be unashamed of the gospel, there is a cost to following Christ. And, of course, the Bible doesn't promise protection or, success. It promises persecution for Christians. But on the other side of that, and that's more of the angle I take throughout the book, that what we're seeing in America right now, the moral decay, the depravity, that's a result of decades upon decades of Christians being silent. So that's why I titled the book, The Cost of Our Silence. And sadly, we're living with those consequences now, but it's not over until Christ returns. So I like to remind people we have a job to do, and we've got to get back to the roots, a biblical foundation, and get our worldview straightened out. And then we need to know the Word so we can be ready, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be ready to defend the gospel, to defend the faith, to give an answer to anyone who asks for the hope that we have.
Well, you suggest that the root of the problem is a weakened church in America, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, with over 300,000 churches in America, look at all the resources we have. We have we have seminaries, we have bookstores, Christian music, all these resources we have at our fingertips, and yet look at the state of morality in America. Something doesn't add up, Jan, and the most obvious answer is that we have been silent. We haven't preached the gospel. We haven't held people accountable for sin. We haven't confronted people in the church. I'm talking about people sitting in the pews and in the comfy seats on Sunday mornings. We can't make judgments on non-believers. They need to get saved. Then once God changes their heart, then their worldview can change and their politics and everything else. But we're talking about the church, and that's who I like to write to, because that's who I like to challenge, that we need to be living what we believe and then being the salt, the preserving influence that Jesus said we would be, and being the light that exposes the darkness. So, yeah, it's the Christians that need to be speaking up and living differently. And I'm trying to be an optimist here, but I don't know if there will be a revival. I do like to say, as long as there is still time, Jesus is not done with us, the church in America, yet. But, boy, time is running out.
I'm quoting you here, David, and this is out of your book, and you say the country is sick and the church is on life support. And you say, should we not call on the great physician to heal and save her? You say, why are so few willing to talk about the fact that sin seems to be celebrated rather than confessed? Are we so wrapped up in our own selfish lives or distracted by the latest technology to care? It's as if we'd rather mind our own business than help the brokenhearted. People are losing hope. Many are dying without the Lord and going to hell, and we're going to the mall as the world is imploding. David, how do you suggest, and Eric, I'd like your input on this too, but how do you suggest we turn this around? I mean, I guess a good place to start might be some of the pulpits in our churches, but it's an enormous task.
Yes, absolutely. It's got to start with the pulpits. When I went through the original draft of this book, I just sensed that I was being really hard, really critical on pastors and religious leaders, and I really had to kind of pull back a little bit, read that again and go, okay, so not all the churches are going emergent or going liberal in that direction. So I really had to pull back because, for example, when I was in California, a lot of the pastors I met with, in fact, all of them, they were solid, they were God-fearing, and they were Bible-believing, and these guys are doing the work of God, but all the churches are obviously smaller because those that are preaching the truth don't have the mega, in general now, they don't have the mega churches or the big congregations in general. This is what we need to do. We need to lovingly approach our pastors and plead with them, encourage them to go back to preaching the whole counsel of God, even the so-called controversial issues, the social issues. They're all moral issues. I make that point in one of the chapters, that the finances, the social issues, it all has to do with morality, and it can all be found in the Bible, how Christians are supposed to live and respond. So we start with the pastors, and boy, that's a big, huge undertaking right there. So since that is such a massive endeavor, we've got to look at our own hearts, and we've got to examine ourselves, examine our faith, and make sure that we have that foundation and we are living right, and then able to do what James 5:19 and 20 says, turn a sinner from the error of his way, because then we will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. So yes, it's the pastors and religious leaders, but it also has to be us, the individual believers.
You know, Eric, you're in churches all the time. I'm sure sure you resonate with this, and you're fellowshipping with pastors all the time.
Yeah, I do, Jan, and it does resonate a lot. What David just said about us testing ourselves and looking at ourselves, 1 Corinthians 13, Paul tells us to do that, to see if we're of the faith. And I think it's a constant, as we walk through life, a constant testing, a constant reevaluation of where we are. When I saw the title of David's book, I kind of muttered to myself, well, why the silence? Because of narcissism across the whole culture. And we think of narcissism as only being in the culture itself, but that stuff has moved into the doors of the church and become part of the fabric of the church. I really think it's hedonism, which is really pleasure being the most important goal and the only issue that really counts. People think of hedonism only being, sexual immorality, but that's not what it is. It's having pleasure as a goal. And inside the church today, as David knows, and many of the listeners, we've talked about it. Anybody who's heard me talk about the confused evangelicals knows that pleasure has become the goal rather than God. When man becomes the focus of the church instead of God, we're in deep trouble.
If you just joined me, you are listening to Understanding the Times Radio. I'm Jan Markell. I have in studio is Eric Barger, my co-host for this particular couple of segments. David Fiorazo is on the line from Green Bay, Wisconsin, because this ministry carries his newest book, The Cost of Our Silence, The Consequences of Christians Taking the Path of Least Resistance. And a former pastor, my producer, Larry Kutzler, wants to weigh in here. Go ahead, Larry.
Thanks, Jan. I found that Eric's comments were very timely and very insightful. And my question really is to David. When you say the pastors need to get back to preaching the word, sometimes I don't think they know how to. I think so much of the culture, the training in the seminaries, the whole genre in the Christian scene today, I'm not sure they really understand. You have to have a heart change to understand what the Scripture is saying to be able to preach it right. And I'm not sure they can. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I agree, and that's why we need to be about pleasing God, not man, and honoring God, not Caesar, because people, if they're worried about their nonprofit status, then the church obviously is not going to be helped at all. They're going to just continue to be in trouble.